Hello and welcome to this week's myNewsWrap, news from the area of Microsoft, SAP, and the world in between. So let's start. Let's see what we have this week as news. Let's start with some, general news around SAP. A comment from the magazine Capital from Germany around the plans of Hasso Plattner that he wants to continue to stay the head of the supervisory board at SAP. And I think that's a quite interesting comment on that topic because, Hasso Plattner is already quite some time heading that one, and maybe a change wouldn't be that bad. But, it's a comment, it's a column around that, and yeah, interesting read if you are in the area of SAP. With that, let's switch to the more technical stuff, starting with one article in the area of SAP Business Technology Platform, Cloud Foundry, by Marius Obert. I have referenced some of his blog posts in previous sessions around the topic of app routing. There have also been some other blog posts around that area. And now Marius has gathered some FAQ around that app router topic, especially the topic managed app router versus standalone app router. So if you have questions on the topic, I think this is the go-to resource when it comes to that. Then I have another blog post from the Kyma team, from the Kyma runtime team by Jamie Colley, who updated the Kyma extension repository on GitHub with a new scenario around exposing gRPC services as an alternative type of doing communication in especially scenarios where you need a very, very high throughput of information, of data. That scenario is completely available on GitHub, so you can try that out within your Kyma runtime that is available as trial. Now some mixed news from the area of SAP. First of all, a podcast that I would like to highlight from the Open SAP podcast series around learning about DevOps and how DevOps can contribute to the SAP environment. The benefits of that by Dirk Lehmann and Boris Zarske, I think two well-known members of the area of DevOps and SAP. So quite interesting 30 minutes. Not a too deep technical dive, but a very interesting look into their thoughts from my perspective. And then I come to the last news from the SAP area, and that was, from my perspective, a highlight this week. And that's the introduction of the Open Documentation Initiative. Now, as you might know, if you're working with Microsoft, you certainly have seen that you can contribute to the documentation of Microsoft, to the official documentation of Microsoft. And now SAP is finally opening up and jumping on the train by an Open Documentation Initiative, which allows you to contribute to SAP documentation. And the pilot program comprises the documentation for the SAP Business Application Studio. And there are some contributions guidelines that you have to follow. Nothing really surprising. But now you can edit the documentation of SAP at GitHub, as you would have done it for years at Microsoft. But it's great that SAP is now moving in that direction. So that's why that's definitely a highlight for me this week from the area of news from SAP. With that, I would like to switch to the Microsoft part of the house. Of course, starting with the hottest topic in town at the moment, namely Azure Static Web Apps. There is a lot of information being pushed out in the last week. So first of all, Getting You Started video by Anthony Chu, who is one of the product managers for Azure Static Web Apps. And he shows you, or he demos you, how to deploy basically a website in minutes. And it's true because the video is just 10 minutes long. Then there is one session that I would like to highlight that will come up in Microsoft Build next week around the topic of Azure Static Web Apps, but not only Azure Static Web Apps, but how they fit into the whole area of offerings and bringing solutions to life with Azure technology, which means Azure Functions, Logic Apps, so a lot of serverless stuff there in there, but also Azure SQL Service and Azure Storage, for example. So that's really cool because it's a broader use case that you will probably see within this session, showing you all the capabilities and all the good stuff that comes there. So really looking forward to that session. Then I also would like to highlight two collections of information around Azure Static Web Apps that came out this week. One is pushed out by Microsoft, which is helping you, getting you started with Azure Static Web Apps with links to tutorials, how-to guides, and code samples, and so on. And then there is one collection of those topics that comes from the community that is available on GitHub, so you can contribute to that one. That on the first glance covers, of course, similar topics like the official documentation, the official resources, but there are also several other resources in there, like learning resources on YouTube, and also some blog posts or informations around making use of Azure Static Web Apps with different technologies like Angular, Blazor, React, Vue, and so on. So that's also, from my perspective, really a go-to resource when you want to start with Azure Static Web Apps. With that, we will not yet leave the serverless area. I will switch to the classical serverless stuff, Azure Functions. There is one cool blog post by Will Villeda, who built a token refresh service for his Fitbit API, making use of Azure Functions and Key Vault. And in order to being able to talk to his Fitbit API. It's a really interesting blog post and I think quite nice use case. And then another one that is also quite interesting from my perspective, covering the topic of observability in a more broader range, making use of Event Stream, of Event Hub, and Azure Functions. And in order to make all the stuff clear and observable, making use of application insights. And this blog post really shows you the big power of application insights that comes more or less out of the box when you link that stuff into your Azure components. And this blog post really highlights all the different things that you can do with that. Things like making use of the application map to find out where are there bottlenecks in my function calls, in my maybe database calls, or calling of third-party components, seeing the whole flow of executions, making you aware of performance bottlenecks, and also what is quite interesting, if the scaling of your Azure Functions is sufficient. So maybe you really have an issue there because of some restrictions that you might have configured. So that's really, really super cool, interesting. Also distributed tracing is in there. So a lot of stuff, really super interesting read. And then one last blog post from the area of Microsoft around the Power App development, but in conjunction with, I don't know how it's called, real code development, in contrast to low code development, I don't know, called Power App development in Fusion Teams. And that is, from my perspective, a really interesting topic due to the fact that we all know low code tools are super useful. They speed up development, but they have limitations. And the idea behind this blog post and all the things around that is to overcome those limitations by jumping off the low-code train and moving to like Azure Functions. When you hit such a limitation, and that's perfectly fine, because Power Apps enable you to do so, to have some code breakouts and combine kind of, I wouldn't say best of both worlds, but combine both worlds in order to get the best out of your scenario. So that's really super interesting. Then let's switch to some mixed news from the area of Microsoft. First of all, there is an enhancement of the Visual Studio Code extension for Bicep language, so for the infrastructure as code. Way to go when you deal with Microsoft resources. It's, I think, no longer ARM. It's really the Bicep lang, and the extension was now enhanced. And what you will have now is a visual representation of the stuff that you have put into your Bicep file, which is really cool, because you see all the dependencies, you see what you have on a single glance. So that's quite cool stuff there. Then kind of a service announcement that I think is important, or maybe important for some of you. If you're using the Azure Blockchain service, this service will retire, and this will retire in the near future, namely the 10th of September 2021. Because the interest in that offering was not as high as Microsoft expected, so they are now switching to collaboration scenario. So they use consensus to have a blockchain service available on Azure, but they will no longer be offering one of themselves. So if you're using blockchain for what reason ever, be aware that you have to switch. And then another blog post that I would like to bring to your attention, if you're working with Kubernetes and service meshes, so maybe you are using Istio. And this blog post describes a notion that I think will come up more and more, moving from Istio as a service mesh to Linked. And this blog post describes why the person, or the company behind the person, wanted to switch to Linked, and how they did it, I think, with zero or near zero downtime, by gradually exchanging several components. And that's, I think, really helpful if you want to go down that path. And then I would like to highlight one topic that I think doesn't get too much attention, surprisingly, but I think is a super important building block when you think about especially extension scenarios between SAP and Microsoft. And that's the Azure Communication Service that came out quite some time ago, which is basically, it's not perfectly correct, but it's Teams without Teams. So what you have is you have services on Azure that allow you to do telephony, SMS, video calls, of course, chatting. And you can simply use those REST services and bring them into your solution in order to enhance that one, without having to have Teams in place. They are interoperable, so you can bring those worlds together. But for your customer, for your user, you do not have to have Teams in place in order to use those services. And I think I did not yet see many, let's say, demos or showcases, especially around the area of, let's say, SAP and Azure Communication Service combination. But I think that's really something one should look into. Within the show notes, I referenced, of course, the documentation. I referenced the official GitHub repository that also contains the roadmap on the service. And because I think that's quite important, because there is some visual interaction with the REST API necessary. If you do chat, Microsoft or Azure also offers a complete UI library with several components that enable you to implement the front end when using those services. So you do not have to start from scratch. Of course, the library is following the Microsoft Fluent Design library or Fluent Design language. But I think that's also what most of us are used to anyway. So yeah, I just wanted to have some heads up on that topic because I think it's a cool service and not yet used that much, at least in the area where I'm working. With that, let's switch to the world between SAP and Microsoft. And there was one very big announcement, which is the general availability of the SAP ERP connector for Power Apps. So this connector is now specifically bringing the worlds together with Power Apps and, of course, Power Automate in order to allow you to call SAP systems, namely BAPIs and RFCs, making use of the on-premise data gateway. So it's kind of the usual setup that you have, but you have now really a connector that is working out of the box. What is funny is the OData is not yet fully supported. You have to use some sample OData connector that is available on GitHub, but it's not official part of the connector from my understanding. But you can import that one into Power Apps via custom connector. But there are plans in order to have that in place out of the box. So you can, I think you can also, let me look. Yeah, you can also have an early preview of the OData connector, which means a private preview where you have to sign up. And this news kind of kicked off from my perspective some other follow-up actions by the well-known suspects. First of all, Holger Bruchelt, who updated his playlist on the Power Platform with four new videos around Power Platform and SAP integration. And Roman Broich, who is Cloud Solution Architect at Microsoft and also working in the area of SAP Microsoft integration, brought out a hands-on tutorial on making use of Microsoft Power App and fetching data from the SAP system, well, based on a well-known scenario, the SAP flight model. So quite some notion in the area of Power Apps in combination with SAP. Now with that, let's switch to the last section for today, or for the last topic of today, learning and events. First of all, you might have seen that KubeCon and Cloud Native Con happened, I think, 2 weeks ago. All the videos that they have recorded are now available on a playlist on the CNCF YouTube channel. So I referenced the link within the show notes. So if you missed one or the other or all of them, that's your chance to catch up. And then there is another playlist that I would like to highlight around Dapper that was also updated recently. Maybe you have not yet seen that. It's around the distributed application runtime that Microsoft pushed out that can help you with building microservices. And there are some new videos in there. I think quite nice starting point if you start with Dapper, or if you also want to get a deeper look into Dapper. And then I also want to highlight one project that wasn't known to me. Maybe you know it, and that's the README project by GitHub. And this project basically wants to put the spotlight on open source developers that host their projects on GitHub and that are often kind of the, let's say, unsung heroes because their stuff is used, but they are not really getting the recognition that they usually deserve from my perspective. And this project wants to get more traction in that area and highlight what folks are doing there, why they are doing that, what obstacles came into their place and how they overcame them. And there is, first of all, the README project per se, which contains several blog posts around the area of open source development. And there is also a podcast attached to that, the README podcast, that brings up interviews with open source developers, well-known open source developers like maintainers like Scott Hanselman, but also kind of the not so famous folks. I think that's really a great initiative, and I didn't know of that one, but now I know, and now you know. And with that, finishing things up, there's also one meetup that is taking place since quite some time that I think might be interesting, also in the area of open source software and bringing together the communities around open source software. So folks who contribute, folks who would like to contribute or would like to start an open source project. And the format is called Contributing. I've referenced the landing page in the show notes. And there are quite some interesting talks that happen on a regular basis. The last one was on open source licensing. And it's obviously sponsored by Microsoft, but I think that's also quite interesting to watch that. Because, open source is getting more and more attention, and well-deserved attention. And with that, we're through the news of this week. I hope I had some interesting news for you. At least I learned a lot of new topics this week. And with that, I wish you a nice Friday. I wish you a nice weekend. And until next week, bye.